Mhm. You want to start, Judy?
Okay. Yes. Good evening, everyone. The Perrot Memorial Library is happy to welcome you to Protecting the Mianus River Watershed with Rod Christie. Now I'm going to turn things over to Char Barnes, the current president of the Garden Club of Old Greenwich, to say a few words. Char?
Hi, I am Char Barnes. Thank you, Judy. And I am the current president of the Garden Club of Old Greenwich. And our club has been a member of this community for over 100 years now. And many of you know us from our green shirts that we wear when we're beautifying the village. And we also have a beautiful butterfly garden at the point that we have cared for decades. And in addition to working to caring for our beautiful town, we have several outreach programs, such as this one, to share our love with the community. These include providing garden crafts and opportunities for our aging population, as well as children's programs that we provide here at the Perrot. In addition, we support the Perrot Library's Nancy Altsnauer Seed Library, which provides free seeds to the community to support everyone's green thumb. Our 2025 season launches on March 16th. And 4 weeks from tonight, on March 19th at 7 p.m., our club members, including several Connecticut Master Gardeners, will have a workshop at the Perrot in person to help you have great success with starting your own seeds. And you can sign up for that on the Perrot's website. And in addition to these programs, we are pleased to present Zoom talks like this, which bring experts in their field to everyone. And if you'd like to support our efforts, you can come to our plant sale on May 10th, the Saturday before Mother's Day at Living Hope Community Church on West End Avenue. This is our major fundraiser and allows us to keep doing what we do. And it's also a great way for us to interact with the community and share our gardening love and share our plants too. And you can find out more about that by visiting our website at www.gardenog.org, gardenOldGreenwich.org. And alternatively, you can support us with a donation, and you can make one from the same website by clicking the donation button on the left side. And again, www.gardenog.org. Now I will give you over to Diane Fox, the chair of our environmental and outreach programming, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Char. Good evening, everyone. We're very pleased to work with the Perrot Library and having Rod Christie, who's the executive director of the Mianus River Gorge, our speaker tonight. And he comes with 40 years worth of wildlife biological experience, has a master's degree of science from the University of Massachusetts, and has been the executive director of the Mianus River Gorge since, well, about the turn of the century, this century. Anyway, we're very pleased to have Mr. Christie with us. And just to give a little perspective, I know many of us know where the Mianus River is in Greenwich, but many of us don't know where the headwaters are, what the purpose is, and the fact that this Mianus River has actually serving in an area of over 100,000 people. So obviously we are concerned about its environment and conservation, and we asked Mr. Christie to give us his focus on how to protect, preserve, and conserve the water and the resources around the Mianus River. Mr. Christie, we welcome you and thank you so much for being willing to speak with us tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to start my presentation, and what we'll do is we'll, go on for a while, talking a little bit about Mianus River Gorge, but also about the Mianus Watershed and what we do for the watershed and what other groups do for the watershed. And then we'll finish up with some question and answer session. Hopefully there'll be lots of questions.
That reminds me, Mr. Christie, if I may interject, we have a chat room for the questions. If anyone has questions during your lecture, please post them, and then we will ask the questions at the end of your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start by sharing this and make sure that everybody can see it. Can you see that all right?
That's perfect, Ron.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So the Mianus watershed is something that we've worked in for really our whole existence at the Mianus River Gorge. We've been around since 1953, and we primarily work in a lot of different areas, land protection, but also research and education, and also stewardship and land management. So let me give you a brief history of the gorge, just because that's an easy way to kind of move into this. We were the first project of the Nature Conservancy way back in 1953, 54. We were also one of the first natural history landmarks by the federal government. We have about 100 acres of old growth forest, which we protect and is one of our missions to protect. And the other is the Mianus River, and it has a drinking water supply for about 130,000 people. Is also a great place for wildlife, and it's a corridor, and it's a migration corridor, and a lot of other things. So the Mianus River Gorge has been around for 70 years. We just celebrated our 70th year. We're an independent nonprofit, and we own about 961 acres over 96 properties. So it's taken us a while to put that together. We have 252 acres in conservation easements, which are not owned, but they're basically restricted as what they could be used for. We continually work with the town's boards, 3 towns in New York State, which would be North Castle, Bedford, and Pound Ridge, and then also Greenwich and Stamford in Connecticut. We do hundreds of partnerships in the region, and I'll talk a little bit about our regional focus, working with other organizations from all over. We're also in a regional conservation partnership called Hudson to Housatonic Regional Conservation Partnership, which spreads all the way from the Hudson to the Housatonic. And so that's a much larger area that we work in. Within the Mianus River watershed, there are about 500 acres that are protected with partners in the Mianus Greenway, and I'll show you those in a minute. And there's about 800 acres that are protected by other organizations such as Westmoreland Sanctuary up here in New York, or the Stamford Land Conservation Trust down in Stamford, and some other entities, also the town of Greenwich and a variety of other towns. So here's kind of our area of focus, and I hope you can see my nice purple pointer here. We do land protection, and this is the Mianus watershed. Okay, the Mianus watershed starts in New York State and moves down into Connecticut and dumps out into Long Island Sound. As you can see, all these little dots represent projects we have going in the Mianus watershed, which there's a lot of them land projects. But we also have a much more regional focus, looking at research and education and in a variety of land management types of projects. We can work all through Westchester County and then into New York City and the boroughs of New York, and then also in Fairfield County and up into Putnam County a little bit as well. So we become a little bit more regionally focused, but our mission is primarily working within the Mianus watershed. Some partner organizations that we work with, these are the ones presently working in the Mianus watershed. Of course, our organization, Mianus River Gorge Incorporated, Greenwich Land Trust, Stamford Land Conservation Trust, the state of Connecticut, which owns some property in the Mianus Greenway, towns of North Castle, Bedford, and Pound Ridge in New York, towns of Greenwich and Stamford in Connecticut. Westmoreland Sanctuary, which I mentioned, was up in the northern reaches in New York. Friends of Mianus Park work down in what we call Mianus River Park, which is very confused with us often. And that's a property owned by this town of Greenwich and the town of Stamford, split down the middle, and is down off Marybrook Road, and very active with dog walkers and mountain bikers and so on. Trout Unlimited is also very active down there. There's a trout management area, and then also they work with us up here in New York as well. And there's several organizations that were involved in Mianus River Watershed Council was involved in the southern part, and now is part of Mianus River Gorge. Mianus Greenway Alliance was involved at one time and has become less involved and not as active. And the Trust for Public Land, of course, was involved in protecting some of the land in the Mianus Greenway. So what I want to do is take you a little tour through the watershed, and from where we start and then to where we finish and talk to you a little bit about what's going on in those various parts, maybe some of the interesting projects that are going on, so you get a feel for it. Here's the Mianus Watershed. As I said, this is the New York portion, and then the Connecticut portion. This is the Merritt Parkway right here that kind of divides the watershed in half. And then down here is 95 and Coscob, where it dumps into Long Island Sound. It's about 22,000 acres, 335 square miles, includes 5 towns. It's 20 miles from source to sound, and we're going to go through that. And that's about 106 miles of tributaries. So all these little sub-watersheds occur that drain into the main Mianus River, which eventually gets down into and feeds. The actual river itself is the drinking water supply for the town of Greenwich, but we're going to look at that. So before we do it, I wanted to just talk a little bit about a project that we just had, because it's going to be present. There's going to be some data present on some of the maps you will see. We just did a wildlife corridor mapping in the town of Bedford. And this was a computer model that we developed that would try to map the ideal corridors for wildlife to move from a large area of undeveloped property to another large area of undeveloped property, creating kind of a link between the two. It was really important to do this because the town of Bedford wanted to know, in terms of their development plan, they wanted to know if there were some major corridors that they could try to protect during that process. It also focuses land protection efforts for nonprofits like myself. And you'll see how that has come when I go further along. The key to this model is a huge database of information, information not only about wildlife species and what habitat they require, but also information just about the topography, the wetlands, the soils, and all kinds of other things that are information that are available. So when you put all these in, the model creates this and generates these white lines, as you see here. These white lines represent what it considers the easiest way, the best path to go from here to here, based on the habitat requirements of most wildlife. We have one model that's for like general wildlife, and then we also ran the model for 3 specific species of wildlife: the bobcat, the forest bat, and flying squirrels, because they're all very specific habitat needs. And so we figured if we could provide the habitat needs for them, we would then be providing habitat for a lot of different species. So I'm bringing this up right now because you're going to see, as we go forward, you're going to see these green spaces. They're going to be gray in the next map that I look at. But the green here represent areas that are 200 acres and larger and have not been developed. Now, they may be under private ownership or they may be protected. And you'll see some and then when we go through the watershed, which ones are which. And these little smaller ones represent 15-acre plus parcels that we also see as important for the movement of wildlife. And then in between, you see these orange corridors that have been created by the model as the linkages between these open spaces. So in doing that and finding these corridors, once we had the model that created the corridors, we then had to test those corridors to see whether they were actually wildlife was using them. And, so we put cameras on a lot of the corridors that we had or were predicted. And you can see here a picture under a bridge, a riparian corridor going underneath a bridge, and the deer are moving through and have been photographed. Deer are not one species that we concentrate on because they're universal. They use a lot of different kinds of habitats. But we did do a model for bobcats. Bobcats have very specific habitat types. And so we ran a model for bobcats. We got all these corridors that were predicted. Then we put cameras on many of those corridors, a sampling of them. And we got 60% of those corridors that we put cameras on had bobcats. So that's a really, really large hit rate, a pretty significant, especially since we only ran the cameras for a 3-week period. So there could have been many bobcats that were just missed. So this is kind of the way this modeling works, and I wanted it to show you, because as we move through these maps and go through the watershed, I'm going to show you those areas that are kind of predicted to be corridors. So let's start our journey as we start here this is our map again that you just saw. We're starting here in northern Greenwich, right on the New York border, right around Banksville area, if you know that area. This is White Birch Farm, and White Birch Farm has got a wetland area, and that's kind of the start of the Mianus River, especially the east branch of the Mianus River. There's also a west branch, but it's less significant. So as we start there, we move north, and we're going to move into the town of North Castle. We're moving here. This is where we were. We're going to move north through the town of North Castle, going all the way up into the town of Bedford, and then wrapping around. I just want to point out this map coloration for you. The green represents properties that are protected, but are owned by, like this one here is Westmoreland Sanctuary. This is the town of North Castle. So they all have different ownership. Everything in orange is owned by Mianus River Gorge. So Mianus River Gorge has all the orange, and the yellow represent conservation easements on properties owned also by held by the Mianus River Gorge. There's a few conservation easements outside that are held by Westchester Land Trust, and some down here by the town of Stamford. So as we move north, the other thing you want to look here is this gray area. This gray areas represent the mapping of those corridors that were predicted by the model, and that's why I wanted to kind of bring that up. As you can see, some of these corridors have already been protected by the Mianus River Gorge, by Westmoreland, by Cat Rocks Park and North, by some other properties. Conservation easements have protected them. So we have successfully protected some of those important properties that were on corridors already, but there are some that still exist, and this helps us to kind of direct, not only land protection activities in terms of purchase or conservation easements, but also working with town government and saying, well, this piece right here, which I'll talk about in a minute in Bedford, is a very important piece in terms of a corridor for wildlife because it's got a lot of wetlands and it's a big riparian corridor. So we're going to move north out of North Castle. We go up through North Castle into Bedford. As we go into Bedford, we have an area here in Bedford that's about 100 acres of property. It's an old sand and gravel quarry, and it's now got these beautiful ponds on it. It's been off and on the market for many, many years. It's now back on the market again for quite a large price. The front part of it has been has an approved subdivision on it, which has never been built, and the back part is all these ponds. It's also a very important contribution. It contributes a lot of water to the Mianus River. And that's really important at this day and age because the Mianus River has two problems. One is that the water quality, which actually is pretty good, but the other is the water quantity. We have problems with quantity because we have a lot of people drawing on the water. Nurseries draw from the river. Towns have town wells that draw from the river or from the aquifer. And this particular area through here, from here all the way down to Banksville that we just came from, is a sand and gravel aquifer. And that sand and gravel aquifer is connected underground. So what happens in Banksville affects what happens here. And Banksville has some very large town wells that draw from the aquifer there, and that affects the aquifer down in Bedford as well as it moves downstream. A lot of the other wells that exist in this area, because most people get their water from wells, are bedrock aquifers. And they're very localized to their particular spot, and they're not as connected. Whereas these sand and gravel aquifers tend to be larger and more porous and more connected. So it's important, this area right here, the reason it's so important is because it's a wildlife corridor, it's an aquifer, and it's also just a big piece of open space that has a lot of other beautiful characteristics, as you can see with these ponds. So as we move through, we have another piece of protected property on another floodplain area up here that the gorge owns. And this is the town of Bedford Green right up in here, if you've ever been through Bedford. Then it turns south and goes down through Bedford into North Castle again, and it enters into the Mianus River Gorge. And the Mianus River Gorge is, you know, a unique property in a lot of ways. It has topography that's very unique. It has a lot of slopes that have rare species on it. It also is feeding and protecting a very significant drinking water supply because it basically surrounds the Barge Reservoir, which is down at the bottom here. And so by the time the water that comes in at the head of the gorge, by the time it gets to the Barge Reservoir, it's about 5 degrees cooler than it was up there. And it's also much cleaner just because they're just working its way through the forest here. And then some tributaries are feeding in as well and contributing more. So as we move south, you'll start to see some green property below the gorge property. That's the start of what we call the Mianus Greenway, which is property that was protected with partners. So specifically, there are 4 properties that are kind of state-owned properties now. The Upper Mianus Preserve here, which is about 121 acres, Blake Coleman here, which is about 83 acres, Lower Mianus Preserve here, 203 acres, and then the Treetops property, which is right down here. And the northern part of this block here is that park, Mianus River Park, which is owned by Stamford and Greenwich. So you have a greenway that extends all the way along the Mianus River and protects a good portion of the Mianus River, therefore keeping the water quality cleaner. This is the Merritt Parkway, as I said, that kind of bisects it. And we're going to concentrate, look at this property right here in this central section next. So as the water comes down from the Barge Reservoir, it travels a couple different places. Some of it gets siphoned off to 2 other reservoirs over here. One is called the Rockwood Reservoir and the Putnam Reservoir, and I'll talk about them in just a second. But the main river comes down, and this is a crucial part right here because it meets the other East Branch, which is a huge East Branch that comes up through Stamford. And they both come together on this property right here, which is what we call Taylor Preserve. And we purchased this property not too long ago. It was up for development, and the local land trust, Stamford Land Conservation Trust, was having a hard time getting a hold of it and didn't have the resources. So we came in and found resources to protect that property. And it's kind of a key pin for this whole area. Stamford Land Trust owns the Allschultz Preserve, which used to be a Nature Conservancy property, was given to them. They also now have purchased another property in this area here. So we're starting to get this big kind of nice piece of protected property at this key juncture between the 2 branches of the Mianus River. And then here again, this is picture of Taylor Preserve, and this is the Merritt Parkway. So as we move down past the Merritt Park, we get to the Treetops property, and then we keep going down, and eventually we reach Long Island Sound. But before we get to Long Island Sound, we have the Route 1 bridge right here and the Route 1 dam of the Mianus River. And this is a major dam here, one that fish can't get over. And so the town of Greenwich and other entities and organizations, but mainly led by the town of Greenwich, put a fish ladder on the Mianus Dam, or on this pond dam on the Route 1 dam. And it allows fish, mainly river herring, alewife, and sea-run brown trout, to move up over through this system of ladders to get on the other side and into the pond. And this pond goes all the way up, and they actually breed in that pond. And this is probably the most significant breeding population of herring in all of Long Island Sound. So it's a really an important resource. We also have some fish, whereas herring and alewife are what we call anadromous fish and move out of salt water into freshwater to breed. We also have some species that actually go from freshwater down into salt water to breed, the American eel being one of those. And the American eels do move back down the fish ladder as well. And then when they come back as little tiny babies, after they all go all back to the Sargasso Sea and come back and float up, they come as little tiny elvers, and they actually climb up the edge of the dam on a netting that is provided for them. And so they also sample for eel populations as well. And then right after the dam is Long Island Sound, Cos Cob and Long Island Sound. So as we said, the Mianus River is a tributary to Long Island Sound. It's important breeding. Here you have the river herring breeding. It's also an important corridor, riparian corridor, and it's a recreational resource for a variety of different species, for fishing, hiking, and also for people fishing, hiking, and observation and passive enjoyment. And the last thing it's a drinking water supply, which is, I'm sure, something you are aware of, because that's where Greenwich gets its water from the Mianus River. The town of Greenwich, actually, if we were to go up off Valley Road right here, there's a filter plant. And that filter plant, there's also a dam. In fact, the river herring can come all the way up to that dam, and then they have to stop because this dam is too high and there's no ladder on it. But this pond here is a pond that actually they take water from into the filter plant, and then the filter plant filtered the water, and that provides the water for the town of Greenwich. They're only allowed to take a certain amount of water, because if they take too much, there won't be any water flowing downstream, and that affects, obviously, the migration of fish. It also affects everything else that lives in the river itself. Now, the other part of the water system for the Mianus River, as we said, the Barge Reservoir or Mianus Reservoir spans 2 states in New York and Connecticut. And it has an aqueduct system that feeds down to the south and to the west, to the Rockwood Reservoir and the Putnam Reservoir. And there's another filter plant on the Putnam Reservoir. And that water is the water for Rye, Rybrook, and Portchester in southern New York. So sometimes you can come and you can see, in fact, you might have noticed off of the Taconic Parkway when you go up North Street, that the Rockwood Reservoir had been very low for the last couple of years. And recently they just did a huge new pipe that went from Barge all the way to the Rockwood. So the Rockwood has been nice and full now, and Barge has less water in it. So it's kind of an interesting system. So how do we manage this watershed with all these things going on and different needs, whether it's wildlife or people? What are some of the things that we as an organization, Mianus River Gorge, can do to manage it? Well, before we think about managing, we have to think about the land itself and how the land has changed over time. Up in New York State, which is the headwaters for the Mianus River, 75% of New York State was entirely cleared of forest. And the remaining 25% was just in the mountains, the Catskills and the Adirondacks. So there was almost nothing here. All the predators had been killed. White-tailed deer had been almost eliminated, extinct in New York State at that time. Of course, they've come back a lot since then. Number of farms, 241,000, over 23 million acres that was farmed in New York State. Here's the Mianus River Gorge. Mianus River Gorge, one of the few old growth forests, was never cut. So you can see the line of the forest here along the Mianus River. And this is some of the old land that was all cut and farmed and then is now starting to come back to forest. This is a 1926 aerial. So the Gorge has a research and education program, and it works with 3 different levels. Wildlife technician program works with high school students, and then we have an undergraduate internship program that works with undergraduates, and then we have a graduate student program as well. And they're designed to all work together. The high school students come out of a program in New York State. There's a program called Research in the Classroom, and they have it in their actual school, in their classroom. And then they come to the Gorge as a student, and we give them a project, which is a 3-year project, which they do as part of this class. It's our chance to teach them study design, teach them field work, teach them data analysis, teach them how to write papers, how to publish papers. Some of our high school students actually publish papers, and they all go to peer-reviewed journals. And then they also, some of them make presentations to natural resource conferences. So it's a pretty active program, and the staff and the graduate students help to mentor the high school students in the program itself. But we do this because all this research provides us data to answer questions about how to manage the watershed. And one of the things we have to manage is this incredible creature called the white-tailed deer, which is an ecosystem engineer. And basically, when there's regeneration or trees trying to grow up to bigger trees, the deer influence that by browsing it, especially in the wintertime. They eat lots of nice herbaceous wildflowers like lady slippers and things like that. And they also contribute to the spread of non-native species, invasive species like here, the garlic mustard, because they eat the native ones and there's less competition, so that the non-natives ones tend to take over. And because of all that influence with the plant life, they also influence the animal life. They influence ground nesting birds. They influence amphibians and reptiles. And they influence water quality, because the water quality is a function of a lot of plants holding the soils. And when the soils are not held, then we get erosion, and that affects water quality. This is what we want to see. We want to see a nice carpet of lots of wildflowers on the forest floor, which are helping to hold it all together and providing habitat. And one of the reasons the deer population has rebounded so amazingly from when it was almost extinct is because there were no predators. The predators were basically wiped out, and what few deer were left, or the ones from the Catskills and the Adirondacks, moved south and started to recolonize an area that was becoming very shrubby, because a lot of the farms had been abandoned when people moved west, and so there was a lot of new habitat for deer, and it was the perfect habitat for deer. So recently, we've had some new predators move into the area. The coyotes have come south through Canada and moved back into this area, and are somewhat of a predator, although not a great predator for adult deer. Bobcats have moved into the area, especially doing pretty well in these suburban areas or even urban settings where you wouldn't think you would see them, but chances are you don't even know they're there, and they're actually, because they're so kind of a quiet, unobtrusive predator, that you don't even know they're there, and they don't really interact with people very often, but they are quite common in this whole area throughout the Mianus watershed. And they do take down small deer and things like that and have some predatory function. And the last one that's moving in, especially in the last few years, are the black bears. Black bears used to be just a transient from time to time that would come through our area, and now they're breeding here and spreading, and there's more and more of them all the time. The gorge has, we have a big bear study that's very regional. We have a big coyote study that's very regional. It goes down into New York City, and we look at bobcats as well. So these are kind of things that we keep in track. And the other thing we look at them is because we need to learn how to coexist with these predators. These predators are very important to the ecosystem, very important to control of deer populations and rodent populations and everything else. And if we can't learn to coexist with them, we're going to have issues associated with this, too many deer and overpopulation, which is, I'll go on to in just a minute, what the impacts of deer are. So coexisting with predators is a big part of something that we are learning to do, and hopefully the gorge can help in that education process. So what is it that deer do, and why is it better if we can reduce the number of deer? Well, what they do is they eat everything. This is an exclosure that was put up, okay? This is inside the exclosure, nice regeneration of tulip tree and a lot of other woody species. Outside the exclosure, all invasives, non-native species, all deer resistant. So what happens is when you get rid of the natives, these come in because there's no competition, And then the deer don't like these, so these spread and become the general plant community. And many of you, I'm sure, have gone through forests and seen just barberry spread everywhere. And that's one of the issues, just one of the many invasive species that we're dealing with. The other is that there are certain species that the regeneration is really important. For instance, hemlocks. We have a hemlock forest at the gorge, and these little tiny hemlocks are just candy to the deer. They love to eat them, so we don't get a lot of regeneration. As a result, we have to kind of protect them in some way, reduce the number so we can start to get some regeneration. Because we have hemlock trees that are 400 years old, and eventually they're going to die, and they're going to need something to replace them. And of course, there's many other issues of non-native invasives like the woolly adelgid, which you can kind of see on this little hemlock tree. The poor little hemlock tree has already got woolly adelgid on it, eating it. And that's another thing, a huge project for us. And we spent a lot of resources every year to combat the woolly adelgid. What we hope for and what we are seeing as we reduce deer numbers, and we do have a deer management program that's been going on for about 15 years. As we reduce deer numbers, we start to see a resurgence of species that we didn't plant. These species came right from the seed bank. They were in the soil, dormant in the soil, and every time they came up, the deer would nip them off, okay? But the seeds are still there and they're still coming up. And so we get things like pyrola here, or, lady slippers, or, trilliums. We get lots of different species that are coming up that are just coming from the seed bank. Now, the other thing that the homeowner can do, and what people don't realize is that I like to say a messy forest is a healthy forest, and that is true in a lot of ways. Because when trees fall, and they naturally do fall, even in old growth forests like ours, if those trees are left on the ground to rot, they're very, very important to the whole soil component and the ecosystem. For instance, I see a lot of people that go through the forest around their house and they rake all the leaves, or they cut up all the wood and they stack it in a nicely neat little pile. Unfortunately, when those trees are down and rot in place, not only do they help promote what's called mycorrhizal fungus. In other words, they get fungus in them, and that mycorrhizal fungus creates a network through the ground, and it links to a lot of certain types of trees that require and do better with that linkage. And I know you've probably read books about, this, how trees talk to each other underground through mycorrhizal networks and all this other things. That's really important. And there's some trees like oaks that just don't do well unless you have the mycorrhizal fungus. So if we look back on the history of the land and we say, okay, there's this land that is, was cut over and grazed, and it had, or it had, farmed, and the soils were damaged, the soils were impacted, and now we're trying to grow another forest on them. They're not doing too well. A lot of this secondary forest is not doing too well because it doesn't have the mycorrhizal component. That takes almost 100 years to develop underground. So we can help that by leaving the logs down. Those logs are also important wintering areas for a variety of insects and mollusks and amphibians and everything else. They help to fertilize the soil. They help to add to topography. Every time a tree falls over, its roots come up, they create a little dip that creates a little wet area that gathers water. They have another area where the root rots and it creates a little mound, and that's a dry area. Those differences are going to be really important as climate changes and things need to move or migrate to find the type of habitat they need to survive. So I said this is our graduate program, our research program. There's a variety of different hundreds and hundreds of studies that we've done, trying to apply those studies to answering questions about management. We do a lot with wetlands. We do a lot with hemlock forest and adelgid and changes in forest composition. And so there's a variety of things we do. Wildlife technician program, as I said, it concentrates on the high school students. We also gather interesting data for it, but it's also about the process of the education process, the study design, the field work and data collection, the data analysis, and the public presentation. This is the Northeast Natural Wildlife Conference, and this also one is Northeast Natural Wildlife Conference, and data collecting. And then we have the college internship in suburban ecology, which is our undergraduate program, where students come in and they're here for 8 weeks. Sometimes they're here during other semesters as well. And they get immersed in all that we do, all the different projects. They work with the high school students, they work with the graduate students, they work with the staff on all different kinds of things, both in research and also in land management. Just an example, one of our graduate students, one of the impacts of Asian earthworms. I mean, Asian earthworms are the species that hasn't been around very long and has dramatically changed the forest in terms of destroying the duff layer, the forest, that's that leaf layer on the forest floor, by just eating it so fast that it doesn't, the native plants don't even have a chance to use the nutrients, the nitrogen that comes out of that process of decomposition. They just, it gets washed off by rain, it goes into the water system, it goes past the native species, and the non-native ones, which like intense nitrogen and a lot more nitrogen, they flourish. So it's impacting a lot of things, and these earthworms are very mobile and very hard to control. So we're learning a lot about them. And of course, on a regular basis, and I know won't go into detail on this, there are just hundreds of invasive species from vines and all that have ecosystem changing abilities. And so they're ones that we try to control. We try to do a kind of a triage situation where the worst ones we deal with first, and the newest ones we try to eradicate before they get established, and so on. But that's a huge whole nother talk. So this is porcelainberry, which is a very significant vine. You'd see it all the way up and down the Sawmill River Parkway, the Bronx River Parkway. All the trees are just covered in it. We also try to protect declining species. This is kind of an interesting example. When you take a big piece of forest and you cut a path through it with a road or a power line or even a trail sometimes, you allow species that are parasitic, like the cowbird, this is a baby cowbird, to get into the middle of the forest where only warblers, certain warblers live, and they nest in this deep forest. Now the cowbirds parasitize the nest, lay an egg in the warbler's nest, and that poor warbler takes care of that baby cowbird, and the baby cowbird kicks out every single other baby warbler until it's the only one left, and it's being fed by the little tiny warbler mother. And so parasitic nesting like this is a result of something bisecting a forest area and allowing these parasites, these cowbirds, to get in there and parasitize the internal forest warbler nests. Oh, what happened here? Sorry, hold on. I lost something here. Are you seeing this as a whole screen, or are you seeing this as a small screen?
Hey Rod, it's a full screen for us.
Oh, it's a full screen. Okay.
Yeah.
Split screen.
Okay,
Oh,
so it's fine. All right. So the other thing beyond is that we are going to, the other thing that Mianus River Gorge does is we work a lot on restoration of damaged habitats. These are, areas that are covered in invasive species right now. Often it's a function of a species that we've just acquired and it's in really bad shape. And so we try to put it back into good shape. So here's an example of Levine Meadow, which was overtaken by non-native invasive plants. And you can see it's there. The other thing about it is the emerald ash borer, which is another non-native species, came in and killed all the ash trees. So it was a bunch of dead ash trees and a bunch of invasive species loving all the light that they were getting. And so we moved forward with it, and this is what it looks like now. This is a restoration, complete restoration. We took out the dead native ash trees. We left some for cavity nests for birds, but a lot of them were going to fall down. We reseeded. We actually haven't reseeded it yet. This is before it was reseeded. It's about to be reseeded next spring. But we did come in and get rid of most of the invasives along the edges and in the middle, and then natural things kind of came back in. So this is one of our restoration projects as a meadow, and we do quite a bit on meadow restoration. Here's a wetland restoration project that we have. And this is a wetland that again is overrun by invasive species. The vines are up over the trees, making the trees fall down, and there's nothing living underneath them. This is it present day, and right back in here is a pond, which you could never see before, and now you can see it from the road, and you can look down through it when the leaves are off. Replanted this with a variety of different species, and a lot of it's come back on its own, and now we can maintain it because we can mow this wet meadow and keep it from going back to non-native vines. Here's the equipment we use, which is a big project. We've become very creative in how we fund some of these projects. This project of the wetland restoration was actually funded by somebody had done something wrong, a developer, and he had to mitigate that at another location because he couldn't do it on site. So he did it for free, basically, for us. He did all this wetland and opened it all up for free as part of his mitigation process. The other thing we do is we propagate wildflowers to help to add back into the ecosystem and add into these restoration projects. We've had a couple of the garden clubs here in Bedford. The Rusticus Garden Club helped to fund a wildflower garden or a wildflower seed place where we bring in seed, plant it, and grow wildflowers, mostly woodland wildflowers, but some field wildflowers as well. And then we take the seed that comes from these beds and we plant that seed out into the preserve again. So these are the seeds are originally come from the Mianus River Gorge and lands that we own. And then we grow them and then we put them back out again. And then we also take individual plants and put them out as well. I'm in the process of kind of winding down this wildflower garden now, and we're going to next spring have a lot of plants going out into restoration sites. So these are mostly some of the woodland wildflowers that I work with. And there's about, I think I've had over 40 species of wildflowers that I've grown successfully from seed to adult plant. Some of them take a long time, but so our goal is to try to say, these are the kind of hillsides that we want. This is an east-facing slope in the gorge, and this is another east-facing slope. They tend to be very rich and diverse. This one's dominated by blue cohosh. This one's dominated by black cohosh. And that's our goal, is to get some of these established and to have them thrive. Because with this, we get the habitat that we need for ground nesting birds and for a variety of other things. They also protect the soils and a variety of other functions. And the last thing that we do is we have a consulting wing to the gorge as well, where we have a variety of consultations that we perform. We did a big project with the Bedford Garden Club where we went to a whole bunch of different landowners' homes and counseled them on what invasive species they had on their property, how they could control them. We gave them literature on it. We talked about their gardens and their woodlands. And so that kind of local consultation. And then we do some much larger projects where we work with much bigger landowners on bigger parcels. And we do some management plans, and we do mapping, all kinds of other things. So there's a lot of different consultation activities, and they're some of them are very local and some of them are very regional. And some of them develop really good linkages with other organizations because we help them on various projects. So that is the end of my presentation, and I can get out of this and ask for some questions.
You're still there, Rod?
I'm still here?
Okay. There's a series of questions that I'll just read out to you.
Yeah.
And the first one is, what would happen if the Mianus River Dam on Route 1 were removed?
Well, one, you'd probably have a lot of unhappy people that live along the pond. But that would be probably the primary one. But right now, the Mianus Pond behind the dam does successfully act as a huge breeding site for river herring and alewife. It's a
Right.
really important resource for that. If you removed it, it would just be the river. They would get less breeding, probably because it's just not as big.
Mhm.
You would get maybe, unfortunately, you still have the dam at the filter plant that's preventing
Yeah.
fish and things from going farther up. So until you did something about that dam, you wouldn't allow, the breeding to go all the way up, farther up the river. So I don't know. The impact is, it would, there are some issues associated with siltation on the dam. There's some issues associated with a lot of geese on the dam. And I know they've been trying to monitor and take care of, reduce the geese population. But it's kind of a neat resource. And right now with the ladder, it's not that detrimental in terms of, that dam.
Well, you mentioned the other dam up at the Mianus filtration. Would there be any benefit to removing that dam?
Yes, there would be a benefit to removing it. Unfortunately, right now, it's how they get the drinking water for the town of Greenwich, because they pond the water behind the dam and then
Yeah.
suck it off into the filter plant. So, and you can't get the water into the filter plant unless you impound it somehow. So that's a big obstacle. Now, if you
Yep.
put a ladder on that dam, we've looked at that dam and it's very high and it's very hard to put a ladder on it. So there might be a technique, there might be a way to do that, but it's difficult. It's
But it
difficult.
would be worth exploring perhaps at some point.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Another question, septic systems seepage into the Mianus River. What can we do about that?
Well, we had a graduate student who actually worked on nitrogen and phosphate in the Mianus River watershed to see whether it was problematic. And we actually found that the nitrogen leaching into the river right now and the phosphates were actually quite minimal, which is a good thing. And I think, in fact, she had a hard time finding any high nitrogen levels. Probably the best or the highest nitrogen levels would be in the pond, and because of the goose population there. And, the goose population feeds on the lawns, goes back into the pond and, leave all their excrement into the pond, and that ups the nitrogen level in the pond. But the river itself was actually in pretty decent shape, and we couldn't find any really hot spots where septics were creating a problem. So as long as they're not building septics close to the river, they're keeping that riparian corridor, they're preventing, things from leaching down. I think the river's in pretty decent shape right now when it comes to nitrogen and phosphate.
What about using fertilizers and pesticides?
The key there, I think, is people have a tendency they want their lawn to go right down to the water. And so they tend to mow their lawn down to the edge of the river or to the edge of the pond. And as a result, everything that washes off their lawns washes into the water. If they could keep a buffer and have some sort of a buffer between the water and their lawn that was mowed less often and was a little taller, that buffer helps to filter things out before they get into the water. We had a program called Buffers for Beauty where we concentrated on how you could build buffers that were really gorgeous and everything like that, but they did just that. They buffered the properties. The other thing that the buffers do is they prevent the geese from going onto your lawn to some degree, because the geese don't like to go through tall grass to get to your lawn. They want to be able to walk right onto it from the water. So if it's a huge lawn, they'll fly into it. But in many cases, if you provide a buffer, you can actually reduce the amount of goose usage of your lawn as well.
That's a very good point. Are there coy wolves in the reserve?
Well, what happens is the coyotes in this area have a certain amount of wolf DNA, because what they did when they moved into this area, they didn't come straight from the west. They came through Canada and came down. As a result, they bred with wolves, and they have a certain amount of wolf DNA in them. So the term coy wolf or coy dog or whatever is not too accurate, but it just means that the eastern coyote that we are seeing here is a little bit bigger, tends to be pack up a little bit more, and has a little bit of wolf DNA in it, which in the long run might be a good thing because that helped to control the deer population.
Good point. Another question was, do you have the experience using the beetle that eats woolly adelid?
The woolly adelgid, our program is pretty comprehensive in terms of the woolly adelgid. We have, we've used a couple different beetles. There have been several generations of beetles. Originally, there was one from Japan that was introduced back in 2022, and we put some of those into the gorge, and they didn't do too well. They just didn't survive. They eat the adelgid, but they don't survive the winters. That same beetle still exists and is still being marketed, but there are other generations of beetle that are probably better now. There's a beetle from the West Coast that's found on Western hemlock, which we have also introduced to the gorge. And there's a new species of fly that's also found on Western hemlocks and all this is being run through the Hemlock Initiative at Cornell University. So Cornell has gotten some projects. We have a graduate student right now working on all this variety of different projects associated with hemlocks and hemlock, what we call biological controls. In the short term, there are some spraying techniques that can be used to spray hemlocks. Sometimes people don't like to spray pesticides, but this is one case where a basal bark spray, where you're spraying the trunk of the tree on a hemlock tree, goes up into the canopy and kills the adelgid. And because hemlocks are not a flowering tree, they're not a bee pollinated tree, but wind pollinated, it doesn't have any impact on pollinators. So we use that extensively right now in the gorge until we can establish a good population of biological control agents.
Given that there are so many native trees that have been damaged by invasive species, has that impacted the biodiversity in native forests?
Definitely. I mean, the biggest one we saw, of course, was the white ash that had just been devastated by the last surge, was the emerald ash borer that came through a few years ago. And we've had, 60 acres of ash just disappear, all gone at the same time. And, there's just a huge die off of ash, and you see them everywhere falling down on the power lines and everywhere else. And we're going to see the repercussions of that a little bit. We also have had other species that have impacted, tree species as well. Of course, we used to have a ton of chestnuts at one time, and they've been basically gone, although there's some hope that we might be able to bring them back now. You're going to see us shifting. Oaks are going to be more common as the dominant tree. Maples, sugar maples are they're still hanging in there. They don't like this warmer weather, but they are definitely hanging in there. Red maple, of course, is very adaptable, and a lot of the species are, quite adaptable. But other ones, tulip trees, the yellow poplar or tulip tree is a tree that's a southern tree and now moving north and taking over some of the canopy where we're we've lost other trees. So we may have some southern species that move north and help to fill those niches where other trees have died off. We try to keep invasive trees like Ailanthus altissima and Paulownia and things like that, which tend to come in on these gaps in the forest. We try to keep them out because they're have their own issues, with Ailanthus being the host tree for the spotted lanternfly, which is another invasive. And so it's going to be a changing. There's no question this forest is going to change, because we continue to have more and more invasive pests all the time.
And I think the last question, but there may be more coming. How are you controlling the deer?
We have a two-pronged approach to deer control. We have a hunting program where we have a whole series of hunters that are certified through us and have been hunting with us for years. And we have deer management units, and they hunt in these various units. So we do have a deer hunting program. We also have, to some degree, an after the season hunting program too, which some people call a cull, but it's also used to try to get more numbers when we can't get enough through our hunting program. So the combination of the two has been quite successful, and we have a series of monitoring stations for vegetation monitoring, which is the easiest way for us to really determine how successful our deer program is. I mean, we can look at population numbers, which we have different ways of trying to calculate population numbers, but also we want to know the impact on the trees and the regeneration. And so by monitoring these plots, we can see what's regenerating and what isn't. And we're starting to see a lot more regeneration of shrub species that were almost obliterated when the deer population was very high. We're seeing a lot more wildflowers and a lot more herbaceous species coming back. And so we're pretty pleasantly satisfied with the way it's going and the direction it's going. It's a difficult management tool. It's very difficult, and it takes a lot of time and effort. And our staff puts in an awful lot of time to try to fix that problem.
I can understand that. I think that's the end of the questions. Does anyone else have any other questions they wanted to ask? I guess not. Well, I have to say, Rod, this has been a wonderful lecture. It really has. You've covered so many topics within that watershed area, and I think many of us have learned a great deal. I really appreciate it, and all the efforts that the Gorge people are doing. Congratulations on your work, really, because it's not easy, it's tough, and it's
Yeah,
wonderful to see it. And the Gorge
it's
is,
definitely tough, and it's definitely time consuming, and it's expensive trying to keep a nonprofit going and paying for all the, I mean, at Hemlock alone, we spend about $30,000 a year just working on hemlock trees, just trying to keep our 400-year-old hemlock trees in good shape so that they can provide seed and grow new trees. And so we have that genetic component, that's
Yeah.
still intact. So it's a long process, but a labor of love, as they say.
I'm sure. And there's one last comment. What do you do with the dead deer? Wolf Conservation Center can use them. So,
Yeah, we have the hunters tend to eat the meat themselves, so they
Yeah.
tend to take their own deer. And we do, during certain times of the year, get more deer than we can use if it's, and there may not be a way to process the deer. Any deer that we get are in a lot of cases, to be honest with you, sometimes we will shoot a deer, and then before we can even get to the deer, the coyotes have already eaten part of it. They're that fast. They just key in on us, and if that happens, then it goes to the Wolf Conservation Center. We take stuff to them quite often. We do take it to other places, but generally everything is used. If a deer itself is not wanted by a hunter or a staff person, then we take it up right now. We take it to a center up in Putnam County where they process it and then distribute it through the food bank. So we contribute hundreds of thousands of, not hundreds, thousands of pounds of meat every year to the food bank.
great. thank you again, and we really appreciate your comments tonight and look forward to seeing more work. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Oh, would you give us the a contact for you too? That was the other thing. There are people who want to contact you.
Sure. Let me go back to that first slide and has it right there. I'll leave it on the screen.
Great.
Let's see. Let me share the screen for just a second. So this is my contact. Rod Christie, Executive Director, Mianus River Gorge. It's rchristie@mianus.org is my email. Phone number 914-234-3455. Or you can go to our website at www.mianus.org.
Thanks again, Rod, and good luck, and we hope to hear more in the future.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.